You're listening to Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right, well, hello, everybody. As you can see, I'm Eric Vansel. I am not joined by Daryl today. I actually kind of hope I will be joined by Daryl soon. Unfortunately, he lost power in his studio, so he's probably realistically not going to be able to join us, but he did say that he would try, so hopefully he jumps in on that. But hey, you know what? We still have some Star Wars to talk about today, and you guys who are chatting with me live, we're going to discuss it together. Maybe we won't get Daryl in there, and hey, who knows? Maybe Daryl might just hop on his phone or something and watch it and chat in. That would be cool. So the big story this week, or at least one of them, because as you guys know, there's a million stories that are constantly being talked about in Star Wars, and part of what we do is we try to actually weed through the ones that are, well, maybe more on the rumor side versus stuff that's a little bit more factual. But I thought that this would be a really good topic. Both of us were looking forward to bring it to you, obviously, but either way, it's fine. This is something that, of course, has been talked about over and over again, and that is the Ahsoka series, and how is it going to basically include other parts of the canon. And I think that that's one of the big issues that a lot of these series, quite frankly, are going to start facing moving forward, is that how are they going to fit into the other canon? Because the problem is, you have a twofold issue. On one hand, you have all the hardcore fans. You have even what I would say are some of the more hardcore, casual, like hardcore casual fans. They're not quite the really nerdy or geeky ones, but at the same time, they're still really into it, right? And they follow a lot of this stuff. You see this all the time with Disney, with any of their properties. Most particularly Marvel type stuff. You see it a little bit with DC too, but it's mostly a Marvel thing where they're basically casual in the sense of they don't know all the comic books, they don't know every little, character, everything like all the comic fans do. However, they are pretty versed on all the cinematic stuff, and they're the ones that are going to follow all the Marvel TV shows as well. And you're starting to see this a little bit with Star Wars. Now, Star Wars, of course, doesn't have, even as long as it's been around, they haven't pumped out as many movies, actually, as the Marvel Universe has in even only the last, 15 years or so. But what's interesting, though, is that you're starting to expand and build this canon of content with Star Wars. Now, of course, with the old expanded universe, they were doing this, right? You had the original trilogy, then you had the prequels, but even before the prequels, you started getting all these novels, and you actually had a bunch of comics as well. And so one of the things that I think was kind of cool about that was that you were getting this wider palette, this bigger canvas on which you can paint and fill in the gaps of this vast world that Lucas actually created. So now we're being brought to something like Ahsoka, because, as you guys all know, Ahsoka was created for and featured very prominently in the Clone Wars series. Well, then, of course, in probably the most unlikely of scenarios, she became a fan favorite, because everybody knows, if you guys have watched this show for a while, you know that I was not an Ahsoka fan when she was first introduced. In fact, I actually was not really even into the Clone Wars. I didn't like it. Well, I won't say I didn't like it. The problem was I didn't feel it was living up to its potential. And that's honestly a critique that I have on a lot of Star Wars stuff, is that it's good. A lot of it's good. The Mandalorian, I think, is really good, and I think it does live up to its potential. But the Book of Boba Fett certainly didn't. Obi-Wan, I think Obi-Wan did a little bit better of a job in living up to it than the Book of Boba Fett did. But you could easily make the argument that it didn't really either. And that's the sad thing is that, and I think this is what gets fans just so annoyed, is the fact that, you have been handed this property on a silver platter. It's a rich, vast universe of not only current characters that you can expand and enrich, but then you also have pretty much this blank slate, excuse me, to create entirely new characters. And yet every time they come out with the series, yeah, there's good stuff about it. But the problem is it doesn't live up to its potential. And so I think that that's a problem that they're facing even now, where a lot of these shows aren't living up to their potential. And that's the problem that I had with the Clone Wars when the first episode came out and they actually released it theatrically. So for those who don't either remember, or maybe you guys weren't around then, or you weren't old enough, or maybe you weren't even into Star Wars at the time, Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, came out in 2005. And then in 2006, Lucas showed the first, I think it was 2 episodes of the Clone Wars in theaters. And that was pretty cool. But the problem, and they got Christopher Lee to voice Dooku, and they got Samuel L. Jackson to voice Mace Windu. But the thing about it, though, was Ahsoka to me was just so annoying. I mean, she was just, I don't know, it just didn't really appeal to me. And what's funny was, it wasn't like I thought that she was this really cool character that had potential. Most of the time you could say, well, okay, she's really annoying, but if they write her right or they handle her right, this could actually be really cool. Well, the problem was, it wasn't. I mean, I didn't really see that at all. In fact, she was one step above Jar Jar to me. That's how much I disliked her. But I got to tell you, as time went on, I actually thought that, you know what? I mean, this is a pretty cool character, actually. And so by the end of the Clone Wars, I was completely Team Ahsoka, and I was pretty much like everybody else. I'm like, hey, bring this character into Rebels. When they announced Rebels and Rebels came out, I was like, man, we got to bring this character in Rebels. Got to bring it into Rebels. And of course they did. And that was really cool because they continued the continuity, which I absolutely loved. And so now, obviously, years later, they bring her into live action. They get Rosario Dawson to play her, which that was another casting choice that I just thought was sublime. I mean, I had said, and I say this periodically too, way back, I don't know, when we first started the show, back in 2018 or something, I remember whenever it would come up and we would be talking about the live action character or portrayal, I should say, of Ahsoka, I always said the person that should play her is Rosario Dawson. And so it was a bit of inspired casting that they actually got her to do it. And what's funny is, it's really the fans that were responsible for that. Because if you guys remember, there was this whole thing on Twitter where everybody, I think people were making like fan art or something that would, pretty much show her as Ahsoka or whatever. And then she got wind of it and then she reposted it. And then, she finally was kind of like, yeah, I'm on board with this or whatever. I forgot exactly what she said, but then Lucasfilm got a hold of that and they're like, hey, this is actually pretty cool. And Dave Filoni is super protective of this character. So, yeah, I mean, I had high hopes for what this character could be, and in The Mandalorian, they were all answered, and it was all positive. So now we bring us to the subject of today. And again, I'm probably not gonna go as long as I normally would if Daryl were here, because this is, like I said, for those of you guys, if you're watching us for the first time, this is a good time to do this, because I always forget to do this. Definitely hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Usually, Daryl and I do this whole discussion, It's just kind of like two guys talking about Star Wars, like everybody's doing all over the country. We just happen to be doing it on YouTube. And we want to bring you guys into the discussion. So come every Friday, every Monday, 8 o'clock. Fridays, we usually cover news type stuff. Mondays, it's usually either some philosophical thing, or maybe we do reviews on whatever the current show is. So there is some different content from Monday to Friday. So you're not going to want to miss any of it, but you will if you don't hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit that notification bell so you know when we're going to be on. And hey, maybe you don't want to see every single thing that we put out. That's totally cool. When you click on that notification bell, you can actually have personalized recommendations. So that works out in your favor. So tonight, we're going to be talking about, there was basically an interview that Rosario Dawson and Natasha, I'll say her name is Natasha Lou Bordizzo. Yes. See? Usually Daryl does this, but this time I actually have the article up here. So basically, they're just talking about the legacy of these characters, because Natasha's playing Sabine, and Rosario, of course, is playing Ahsoka. And the big thing is, how much is this going to tie into the previous stuff? Now, given that they have the actresses that are playing both Sabine and Ahsoka, even though Ahsoka really was more in the Clone Wars, right? She had a little bit of a story arc in Rebels, but she was created for and was primarily in the Clone Wars, although she did carry into Rebels, so, I mean, that totally counts. Sabine, on the other hand, was pretty much introduced, and thus far, her only appearances have been in Rebels. So Rebels is the focus of this discussion, because it basically comes down to how much do you tie this Ahsoka series to Rebels? Because you're obviously bringing a bunch of people, and of course Mina Massoud is rumored to play Ezra, another Rebels character. So there's a lot of ties to Rebels from the Ahsoka series. And so the question becomes, rightfully so, well, how much do we really need to know about Rebels in order to enjoy this show? And this is what I was talking about before, where you're going to have this issue the more series that you come up with. Now, if you come up with something like, if you come up with a series that is something like what Taika Waititi is threatening to make as a film, where it's all new characters, all new everything, it's maybe in a completely different time period or something, well, then you don't have to worry about it so much, right? I mean, it's just implied that it's a standalone thing. But the problem is, if you come up with something like Ahsoka, okay, even though you're dealing with this after Return of the Jedi, right? So this show is taking place roughly around the same time as The Mandalorian. And in fact, I'm sure that Din Djarin is probably going to make some appearances in the Ahsoka series much the same way he did in the Book of Boba Fett. They happen around the same time. It would make complete sense for them to do this. But the question is, okay, I'm a fan. I haven't seen everything. Maybe I've seen the movies or something, and maybe I've seen the Disney Plus shows. But I've never read any of the comics. I've never watched the animated shows. I'm just not, maybe I'm not into all that. Okay. Well, now you're bringing in a bunch of characters from this animated show. So the question is, do I have to watch this thing? I mean, is Rebels actually necessary? Do I have to go back and, I mean, thankfully it's only like, 4 seasons? But still, that's a lot of time. And so the question is, on one hand, and this is what I want you guys to talk about in the comments section, and, please feel free to chat if you're joining us live. I mean, there's a bunch of people that actually will watch us. They don't chat. We have a few people who chat who are conspicuously absent today. I'm talking to you, Ronaldo, and Voyager, and alt-right comics, and there's a handful of people that chat with us virtually on a weekly basis. But the question that I want to pose to everybody, whether you're watching this on the replay or maybe you're chatting live or you're watching live and you're not sure if you want to chat in yet, and that is, how important do you think it should be for them to include more of Rebels and some of that backstory into the show? And by that, I basically mean, do you want them to include a lot of references to where you would almost have to see it? Because, look, from the hardcore fan perspective, one of the things that we want, and one of the main complaints that we've had, is the fact that they don't tie the universe together enough. Now, they're starting to do that. You're starting to get, not only are you having some of the crossover in the Disney Plus shows that have been released, but even with those shows, with some of the films that they did, love or hate the sequel trilogy, they've been doing this more and more. They're starting to tie together the animated shows, the live action shows, the films, the comics, and they're doing these cross-platform things. A story might start in one and then pick up in another, in other words. So they are doing that. They are tying this universe together, because the biggest problem that we've had as Star Wars fans has been the fact that all you basically had the movies, and then you have the comics, and then you had the novels. You didn't really have the TV shows then. I guess you can count Clone Wars when it came out, but they did have those animated shows, right? Like that Droids thing, which I covered in another show that we did. Which I think is actually on Disney Plus now, if you want to check it out. It's interesting. They did this animated show about C-3PO and R2-D2 and all these weird adventures. I think it was just called Droid Adventures or something. I don't know if it was really necessary for them to bring that back and to show on Disney Plus. Sure, maybe if you want to be a completist and you want to see everything, including like the Ewok adventure shows and all that stuff, but I don't know. But I got to tell you, I did rewatch it a few years ago, or maybe not even that long. It was about a year ago. It was whenever we actually were doing the show. I remember I did a one-off Facebook Live thing or something, and I basically featured this thing, because they were talking about how they were going to release it on Disney Plus, and I'm like, do we really even need this? And I think that was basically the title of it. Do we really even need this on there? And that sparked a discussion of, do we really need every piece of Star Wars content that has ever existed? Now, of course, we can get into that a little tonight too if you want, but generally speaking, other than the fact that it is kind of an interesting show, and it's a little bit better than what I had remembered when I was watching it as a kid, it's one of those things that, again, I don't necessarily think you need to tie that in to anything canon. And of course, a lot of the attitude that Lucas had when he was in control was, look, the only things that were completely canon in his version of the universe were the films. The holiday special wasn't. So these droid adventures, the Ewok adventures, none of that was. Now, when he created the Clone Wars, he did deem that as canon as well, but even the entire expanded universe wasn't. Now, for some people out there who are saying, well, hold on, there were elements of the expanded universe that were, and yes, his whole rule was if he brings something like a character or whatever into one of the films, like for instance, they mention Quinlan Vos in Revenge of the Sith. So now, okay, cool. He becomes canonized. So that was one of those things, but it was really more of a circumstantial thing, right? Interviewers or sometimes the authors that were writing the books, they would actually ask Lucas, hey, what about this? And Lucas would actually go through and go, well, okay, that could be canon. Yeah, no, that's not. Overall, his general statement was, look, the only thing that is true canon is anything in the films or in anything that I basically create, right? But for the most part, yeah, it's not. I mean, there's like he'll make some of them, but I don't even know if he really considers it. He might just tell people like, "Oh, sure." And he's even said in the past, "Look, if you want it to be canonized in your eyes, well, go for it. You know, if you want Thrawn and that whole storyline and everything to be canon, then for you it is." But Lucas was just saying, for me, it's not. And because he was the one that created the whole thing and he was still making properties, right? I mean, he still had stuff that he was planning. He was planning this whole live action TV show. He was going to be doing some stuff. So really his rule of thumb was, look, it could be canon until I contradict it with something, which he did. A lot of people forget that Boba Fett actually had a different origin story than what was presented eventually in Attack of the Clones. And so that story stood until, of course, Lucas came along and was just like, nope, now I'm going to do something else with it. But much to his surprise, and probably a little bit his horror, when he realized how popular the expanded universe became, then he started throwing the fans a little bit of a bone. Because you have to remember something. He never imagined in a million years that the expanded universe novels would ever do anything or capture the hearts and minds and the imagination of as many people as it did back then. And this is something that George Lucas has always done. He has always underestimated the effect of his own creation. You know, he goes through and he creates this amazing thing, and then he doesn't understand the impact it has. You know, most people are actually trying to get something like that, right? They're sitting there in boardrooms and everything, and they're engineering something, trying to make something as even slightly impactful when you compare it to Star Wars. So he underestimated it. He didn't really realize it, and I think he probably would have maintained more control over it if he really knew the effect it was going to have, but he didn't. So once it became wildly popular, and you actually had several books back then hitting the New York Times bestseller list, that's what he started to do a little give back to the fans, right? Like, okay, everybody loves this character a lot, fine. You know, he'll use it in a movie. Now, he might actually change the backstory a little bit. Point is, he would use it. So now you come forward to Disney, right? And Disney is basically, you know, their whole thing was part of the reason why they wanted this property was because of all that stuff. Now, people have actually said to me, wait a second, you're over here saying that part of the reason why they bought it was because of the popularity of the expanded universe and everything else, so then why did they just get rid of it? And the reason is because there have been so many issues and contradictions and continuity problems and all kinds of things. And then, you know, as brilliant as some of those stories were, there were some that were just really stupid. And so as a result, they said, you know what, okay, fine, we're going to forget about this, and we're going to start from scratch. And the only canon things are going to be the expanded universe, or not the expanded universe, sorry, the films. In other words, the original trilogy, the prequels, Clone Wars, and then soon to be Rebels. But Rebels, I think, came under when Disney was still in charge. So George's last thing, I think, was the Clone Wars, basically. And they ended up scrapping that TV series. So I say that to say that fans care very deeply, especially if you're a hardcore fan, about all this peripheral stuff. And so consequently with Ahsoka, you would want to see references at the very least, if not actual continuations of plot points from the whole Rebel series, because that's where a lot of this stuff spawns. So let me just read a couple of these excerpts here, because this is interesting on where they're coming from. So, you have to forgive me, I had to look over here on the computer. So basically, both both Rosario and Natasha were elaborating a little bit, and they're basically saying that a lot of people have not seen Rebels. It's great for them to have seen it, but we've got a standalone chapter as it is. Now, in my opinion, that's probably the best way to handle it, because you can bring in references to Rebels, and the casual fan, people that have never seen Rebels or unfamiliar with it, or maybe they've seen it, but it's been a while, so if there was a reference to it, they would miss it. You could sneak those in, much the same way that they've done in Obi-Wan, they've done it in The Mandalorian, they've even done it especially in the Book of Boba Fett. There's a lot of things, you guys see it all the time on YouTube, right? You know, like 20 Easter eggs that you missed and, you know, whatever. And that's because they will put a lot of things in there for us more hardcore fans, but you also, at the same time, don't want to sabotage the casual fan or just newcomers. What if this is their gateway to Star Wars? You know, you have to look at it like that. Not everybody is going to go back and go, okay, I'll start with episode 4. Because that's generally what people do, right? They do one of two things. They either go in chronological order or they go in release order. So somebody's new to Star Wars, they hear it's this big movie thing. A lot of times they'll go, okay, I'm going to start with episode 1 and go all the way through 9. And I'll even include the standalone films. Then there's other ones that are pretty adamant about, no, I want to experience it the same way that everybody else did when it came out. So that means I'm going to watch 4 through 6, and then I'll watch 1 through 3, and of course now I'm going to watch 7 through 9, plus the standalones. And then, of course, yeah, look, you got the machete order, you got all these other weird, bizarre combinations of orders that you can watch everything in. But the bottom line is, I would probably say a good 60 to 70% of the people are starting with the films. That's going to be their first gateway into Star Wars. But that's not everybody. That's not everybody. There are some people who got into it with The Mandalorian. Remember, we all got mad at them. Like, oh, look at these people that, you know, are wearing the Grogu, well, at the time, Baby Yoda shirt. I mean, how many times did everybody get mad at that? Going, oh, man, these guys aren't real Star Wars fans. They just saw this cute little creature and just decided, you know, it's the same as when you see, like, the Kardashians wearing a Slayer shirt. Or, you know, some of these, like, now don't get me wrong, there's some people, like, for instance, Lady Gaga, right? She's legitimately, seriously into metal. Like, Iron Maiden's one of her favorite bands. She knows everything about them. There are a lot of people like that, but, you know, there's a lot of posers, too. A lot of people wearing it because they think it's going to make them look cool or whatever. And that's what happens with Star Wars. All right, so first thing that we learned from this article, they're going to make it more of a standalone chapter. I think this is a great idea. Because you might think, if you've watched this far, by the way, if you have watched this far, it means you're probably liking what you see. So hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, help the channel out, and hit the notification bell so you can get reminded and notified of when we go on the air and do a show, which of course is every Monday and Friday at 8. You can guarantee that, but sometimes we do actually special shows. But if you stuck with me by now, you might think that I would want a lot of those references, but I actually think it's a better idea for them to just do more of a standalone chapter. So in other words, yes, you know, come in, give us a good story that doesn't violate or change the characters, because again, for those of us that have come up with, let's just say, Rebels in particular, and especially the Clone Wars with Ahsoka, you don't want to mess with what's working. Okay? Sure, take the characters into new directions if you want, but don't make it make sense. One of the problems that I always had whenever they would try to do something different or new with a character is they wouldn't take into account what that character would actually do. It's like, that's what you have to do. You have to say, would this character actually do this? You know, don't do something for the sake of making a character do that. That's just not a good idea. You know, so it goes on to say, you know, Star Wars has been playing an increasingly complicated game ever since the Star Wars TV universe exploded. Of course, it's pulling together continuity featured in the movies, as well as the canonized comics, animated series, games, novels. Everything that I've basically been saying so far. They are making a concerted effort to definitely tie in this universe, which really is a no-brainer. You think that they would have done this a long time ago, right? But they didn't. And I don't know why they didn't, but they didn't. So, you know, it's going on to say a bunch of other stuff. And by the way, this particular article that I'm referencing today is coming from comicbook.com. But there were several, because this, like I said, this has been somewhat of a talking point in Star Wars this week. But basically, Rosario Dawson, when she was responding to an Empire magazine question, she basically said, Dave and John, so that's Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau, are continuing Star Wars in a way where it can be standalone, but it also makes you hungry for more. There have been 2 instances where Ahsoka shows up on a mission. You see how she's interacting with folks, but you don't really get her, per se. Even fans who've lived with her for so long don't know where she's at now in this journey. I like that. I like the fact that they're bringing that up, because one of the things that we understand is her entire history. Like, we know where she's been during the Clone Wars. We get a little bit of an inkling of what's been going on with her between episodes 3 and 4. But that's where we lost track of her, right? This is something like 5 or 6 years after episode 6. Well, what's she doing now? What's she like now? She's obviously, thanks to the Mandalorian, the Book of Boba Fett, we see she's interacting with Luke. Well, that's really more the Book of Boba Fett. So we see from the Mandalorian that she's after Thrawn. We see her knowing who Luke Skywalker is and having them have an interaction. But we really don't know. We know that she left the Jedi Order because she was disillusioned. You know, first she was sort of thrown out of it and accused of this horrible crime. And then when she did have the opportunity to come back, she chose not to. Which is fine. Because, and again, I thought that was a really realistic, good decision. So let's see where we're at here. I'm mainly looking for anything they might have said. Yeah, I mean, they're talking about how the Mandalorian Season 2 set up that Ahsoka and maybe Sabine is looking for Thrawn and or Ezra. So the rest of the story is waiting to be filled in. So these are things that I think are definitely important to bring up and to stay grounded. But again, I think that you could do a standalone story here without necessarily confusing the casual fans who may not have seen every episode of Rebels. Look, I don't even remember every episode of Rebels. I would consider myself a hardcore fan, but I'm probably at this point more of a casual hardcore fan. Because, I mean, anybody that's watched this show for more than a couple of weeks and has read any of the information about the channel, you all know I have been on this ride since 1977. 1977, Star Wars opens. It wasn't even called A New Hope then. It wasn't called A New Hope until like 1980 or something. And they had re-released it in theaters, and I remember, because that was something that confused me too. I'm like, well, wait a second. This movie was called Star Wars, and all of a sudden it's like Episode 4, A New Hope. What's going on? And then, of course, you're gonna, the same question is gonna be in your mind that would be in anybody's mind. It's like, well, wait a minute, this is Episode 4. What's going on with Episode 1, 2, and 3? I thought this was Episode 1. What's going on? And then, of course, as time went on, you actually got the story and understood and heard the story about Lucas. And look, he only thought he was going to have one shot at this, so he looked at his big story. Because remember, when he first started doing this, he actually wanted to make this whole thing one big giant movie, which would have been like some 9-hour film or something. And thankfully, they talked him out of it. But after a while, he started looking at it a little bit more pragmatically, like, okay, if I only get one shot at this, what section has a more of a definitive beginning and end? I mean, you can make the argument that maybe episode 4 doesn't have the most definitive beginning in the world, because one of the things that we all saw right away, right, was that, hey, it almost seems like you were coming in the middle of something. I mean, even though you could say, okay, there's this ship and this bigger ship that's chasing it. Well, what happened? How did that all start? So you could tell you were dropped in the middle of something. But the point is, it still had the most definitive ending. It could be its own standalone film. And you could just fill in the gaps, either with your imagination, or that could be done later. And then, of course, it became what it became. And so I've been on this whole ride for all these years, and I read a number of the Expanded Universe books, seen every movie, read everything I could about it. Still, to this day, I just started Shadow of the Sith, which, by the way, very promising book so far. Not too far into it. It's a long book, but I think that it's actually a really, really good thing. And this ties into what we're talking about, because one of the things that I've been saying is that they're starting to tie in a lot of these different mediums together, right? So it's no longer that the films are existing in their part of the universe and comics and so forth. They're actually tying everything together. So they're all telling different parts of the same story, or maybe even the same parts but from different perspectives. The War of the Bounty Hunters moving into Crimson Reign comic book series was flawless at doing that. The Shadow of the Sith book, one of the reasons why I started reading that, because there was a couple other ones that I had gotten before, is because it seems like every day they're releasing some new excerpt of how many gaps and plot holes and all this stuff that this book is actually filling in, because this is very much dealing with after Return of the Jedi. So this is not another, okay, here's what happens between episode 3 and 4 kind of thing. So unlike Lords of the Sith, which is a fantastic book that takes place immediately after episode 3, this book is taking place, I don't know, it's a number of years before The Force Awakens. I don't remember exactly how long, but it's definitely in that time period. So, again, I think that this is a great idea, that they're doing this standalone storyline to where if you just watch it, you could take it for what it is. If you don't have any backstory at all on Ahsoka or Sabine or any of that stuff, the idea that you could just come in, check it out, enjoy it for what it is, well, that's great. But what it sounds like, what they're doing, which is, again, I think the perfect choice, is if you do want to know more about these characters, like, well, I wonder how Ahsoka got here, or how Sabine got here, or what, any of the backstory of it. Well, now you can go and you can explore that. And honestly, just to basically wrap this stuff up here, I think that that's the smartest move that they can make. Especially with the TV shows. It's like, look, just give us, and again, we've said this over and over, give us a good story, first and foremost. Don't worry about fan service. Don't worry about a lot of these other things. Start with a good story. Once you have that, then you can worry about where it ties in. Because I have no doubt in my mind that when we saw Ahsoka in The Mandalorian, in season 2, I think, and she is kind of like all, you know, questioning that one lady, where's Thrawn? Okay, so I think that her whole search for Thrawn, possibly even Ezra, might be the main crux of this. So, to a degree, you could almost say that you do need a little bit of knowledge about it, but I don't think that you necessarily have to go crazy on it, because I think they're going to explain all that. See, the problem with The Rise of Skywalker is the fact that you had Palpatine coming back, but that explanation wasn't really done in the film. I mean, kinda. In the opening crawl, they made mention that he was back or whatever. But I mean, that was a pretty big thing, that if you're going to introduce something like that in the film, you gotta explain it in that film. You can't just be like, oh, well, if you play like Fortnite or something, which is what they did at first, you got his whole explanation about him coming back and that whole message and all that stuff that they had alluded to in The Rise of Skywalker. They did it in Fortnite. They've done it in a lot of other novels, and I actually think the Shadow of the Sith book is going to do that as well. So if you introduce it in a film, you have to explain it in a film. Or it doesn't even have to be a film, but whatever the medium is, right? You need to do that. And I think that the way it sounds, both from the interviews that both Daryl and I have read about this thing, because we did talk about this a little bit before the show. Again, he feels terrible that he can't be here tonight. Usually we have these really great discussions, and we were talking a little bit about the concerns that we had about this, and that was one of them, is that you can't introduce anything in this series that isn't explained within the series. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't explain it maybe in a future season, right? So maybe you introduce something like, for instance, Grogu. Grogu was introduced in The Mandalorian Season 1, but he really wasn't explained that much until 2. Right? It wasn't until Ahsoka kind of met him and, gave him the whole rundown. Oh, yeah, he was a youngling in the temple and that whole thing. I mean, you knew that he was a Force. You knew that he was Yoda's species or whatever. But the thing is that you still didn't really know a whole lot about him. That was something that was held off. So I'm not talking about, you have to explain everything within the context of that episode or within that season. You don't. But you do have to, at some point, anything that you're introducing during the course of the show, right? So let's just say this thing runs like 4 seasons. Okay. By season 4, everything that was introduced in the first 3 seasons needs to be completely wrapped up. Again, unless you're going to do some film or something. I mean, I guess you could just keep, kicking the can forward, as they say. But at some point, you do have to explain this stuff. So I think from the standpoint of the casual fan, if you out there are a casual fan and you're worried about this whole thing and you don't know what Rebels is, I think you can rest assured. I mean, granted, when this show comes out, we're going to review it. So, if any way, shape, or form we think, hey, listen, you really need to see this show or that comic or, whatever it is, we'll make sure we tell you about it. But so far, just by the way that Dave Filoni has said in his interviews, haven't read too much with Jon Favreau on this. I don't know how involved he is in this. I mean, I'm assuming he's one of the executive producers or creators, but I don't know how hands-on he is with this particular show. If you know, let me know in the comments. But I think it just sounds like, from the cast members that we've heard from so far, with everything else, I think that we're going to get a show where it's going to pretty much stand on its own. You don't need to read a ton of books and like extra materials and watch all these different shows or whatever to enjoy it. That said, I'm sure those of us who have seen Rebels, those of us who have seen the Clone Wars, those of us who have seen or have read some of the comics, I'm sure that we're going to be rewarded with a lot of Easter eggs, additional content, context, because that's something that I think if you're going to start referencing older stuff, right? Because when you have a franchise like this, obviously everything's building on something else. It may not necessarily be in chronological order. It might not be linear, but it is building. And so what I think you have to do in this case is you have to reference things and give it context. And I think if you give it context, it'll inform the casual fan so they won't be completely lost, but it'll reward the more hardcore fan because it's like, oh, okay. And they've been doing this even in Obi-Wan, right? I remember one of the things, and I said this in our review. If you guys didn't see it at all, we reviewed every episode of Obi-Wan. So not right now. Finish this episode first. But when it's done, I mean, unless it pops up on the end card, basically go back and check out our Obi-Wan review because it was pretty cool. And I'm not just saying that because we did it. But one of the things I mentioned in the last episode, when we reviewed the last episode, was that I was really afraid of them ruining the context, the dialogue that we got in A New Hope, right? You basically, the whole "when I left you, I was but a learner, now I'm the master, only a master of evil, Darth, you should have not have come back." I mean, just a lot of that, it had a lot of emotional weight. And episode 3, the duel at the end of that, the dialogue at the end of that, it was a little bumpy, but it was okay, because we always knew, look, these guys faced each other on some lava-like planet, and Obi-Wan defeated him, and Vader got injured, and that's why they had to put him in the suit. I mean, even before episode 3 came out, we all knew the basics of the backstory of that. And so we always, even back in 1977, after Lucas was interviewed and he talked about that, we always knew the context of that conversation. So when Kathleen Kennedy had talked about, hey, you're going to get the duel of the century and they're going to face off again, we're all just like, what? Oh, man, because, that could change the context. But here's what I pointed out in my review. It actually made it better. It gave it better context. The context for that conversation in episode 4 actually made more sense when you factored in the dialogue from the Obi-Wan episode than it did even if you had just left it at the last time they saw each other was at the end of episode 3. And so, oh, yeah, now everybody's going to come in and chat. So Voyager says, where's Daryl? Well, Daryl lost power. And so his studio has no power, so he couldn't do it. And again, one of the things that I should point out too is that I am making progress. We used to do this show together in the same room. And obviously it was a little bit better because you didn't really have some of the delay is not bad, but you do have a little bit of a delay, and sometimes that can make the conversation feel more Zoom-like than real, but that's just kind of the way it goes. I don't know why I'm trying to put my comments up, but they don't seem to be working. Voyager basically says, Eric, do you prefer live or pre-recorded podcasts? That's a good question. When I'm watching myself, what do I like more? It really depends on what it is. I'll give you a good example. I'll just use this show as a good example. Basically, this used to be a pre-recorded show. Well, actually, when it first started, it was an audio podcast. And then we decided to do video. And of course, me being in video production, Daryl too, we basically were like, okay, let's just do what they do with some of the audio podcasts. Like you'll see either bigger podcasts do it or you'll see like radio stations do this where they'll have a morning show, and then what they'll do is they'll just have a camera set up somewhere, basically on a wide shot, and essentially you're just seeing the video of these people recording the podcast, right? I mean, that's all it really is. There's no production value. And then, of course, sometimes if that particular station or podcast actually has a bigger budget, or at least a budget that they're willing to part with to do the production required, you might get a multicam switch thing. So whenever somebody is speaking, they'll end up, switching everything out. Kind of like this, right? Because a lot of times this is what we used to do. I would actually switch like this, and then I would go back to this, and, we would do this whole big, like, production thing. And that's what happened. It started out where we just put a camera, and we just had a 2-shot, and a monitor would be in the center, and it would show a graphic of anything that we were talking about. Because we used to do segments. And then it got even crazier, right? We did this whole multi-camera thing. We had all these different graphics and all this stuff. And it really got to be time-consuming enough to set all that up that we were spending more time basically setting up and trying to deal with the production than the actual content of the show. And so around that time, I started having to live stream for work. I had to start doing live streams for all these big companies and stuff. And we tried to do that. And one of the things that I like, the live streaming thing for this particular show, even though you could fix this, I guess, by going back to doing pre-record and then just setting it as a premiere. But I like the immediacy. I like the fact that, just like now, you're asking me a question, and I'm able to answer it right now in real time. And that's... So for those kind of shows, for those kinds of things, I actually prefer live streams. But there's times, though, where I do prefer the more pre-recorded version. Because if you're dealing with something that's, I don't know, like where you would want really tight edits and a bunch of graphics. And again, I mean, with this production software, I could put tons of graphics. It just, the problem is, because, we need more viewers and everything else like that, we're not full-time YouTubers. So it's not like this is our job where we could just spend all this time, like a lot of these bigger YouTubers, like take John Campea, for example. He's got an entire staff. This guy's got like a staff. He's got graphic people making his graphics. He's got, editors editing the videos. He's spending time working on the stuff, writing the stuff, preparing, all that stuff. We have none of that. I have the capability of doing it because that's actually what I do on my job, but it's a time factor. And then it's also a money factor. So, you guys like what you're seeing. We also have the whole like buymeacoffee.com. We even have, there's a link in the description of every one of our videos. It's like, hey, buy us a blue milk. Throw us $1 or $2 and help support the channel that way. But really what we would love is to get more views and more likes and everything else. Because ultimately, the live streaming thing for us, I think, is great because this whole show was based on Daryl and I just getting together a couple of times, and we would be at work or whatever, and we would get into these really lengthy, involved Star Wars discussions. And people were like, man, you guys, and people would watch us. People would actually watch us talking about Star Wars. It was hilarious. And, eventually enough people just started saying, you guys should just have your own show. And I remember I wanted to learn to podcast at the time. So, I mean, I basically I studied radio. I went to like a broadcasting school where I did video and radio. So, I mean, I could go on the air on any radio station. It was just, podcasting was like a little bit of a different thing. So I had to learn, it wasn't so much the production of it. It was really more the hosting of it. And it was really cool. Now, the great thing about the pre-records is and we used to do this. We would actually pre-record a couple of episodes, at a time. We had to be a little bit careful because if we were talking about things that were timely, we didn't want them to be too outdated. So, if we were just doing character analysis videos or just more evergreen type Star Wars material that wasn't timely, like book reviews or something, well then we could just, do like a whole month's worth of episodes in a day and then kick them out. But I don't know, we started to do the live thing, and what's cool about the live thing is, from a production standpoint, we're able to put it together and make it look cool and give some production value to everybody out there. And it's not too bad for us to do that, right? It doesn't actually take as much to do that. And then also, this is basically an extension of Daryl and I just talking about Star Wars, but it's like, instead of just he and I talking about it, let's open it up to the world to talk about it, right? Let's all get together on a Monday. It's almost like if you just get a group of people to get together a couple of times a week, talk about Star Wars. Which, when you say that out loud, it's a little geeky. I mean, maybe I ought to rethink that. It's a little strange, I admit, but what can I tell you? Really enjoy it. Voyager also says, apologize, I can't put the comments up. I don't know why. I'm excited for Ahsoka. I've been seeing negative tweets about Rosario because of her lawsuit, now dropped and dismissed, but I'm giving her the benefit of the doubt. I like her. Yeah, again, she was the one that I basically said from the beginning should actually play Ahsoka, right? Like, before it was even announced or anything, and we were doing basically fantasy casting or something like that. Every once in a while, either somebody in the chats would say, hey, if you could pick anybody to play, I don't know, Ahsoka, who would it be? Sometimes it would come up just from what Daryl and I were talking about, but Rosario Dawson was always the one that I would pick. I don't even remember if I had an alternate because I was pretty much stuck on her. So imagine my surprise, as I brought up earlier, because fans had obviously locked onto the same thing because people made a bunch of fan art or something, and it actually got on Rosario's radar, and then she actually tweeted about it, and then that tweet ended up getting in the hands somehow of Lucasfilm and Filoni. There you go. Now she's been cast. And so, yeah, man, I honestly think that this is going to be one of the best live-action shows. I really do. And I think that for a number of reasons. Besides the fact that I think that the cast that they have is pretty solid, I also think that, at least what we know now of the direction, the Thrawn's probably going to be involved. It's probably going to be a search for Ezra. There's a lot of like post-Rebels stuff that you can get into. I mean, it's not just post-Return of the Jedi, but it's also post-Rebels, right? So I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do there. And I'm sure that the Mandalorian himself, Din Djarin, is probably going to make an appearance in at least one episode. And I don't think it's going to be like the Book of Boba Fett, where it becomes, a standalone Mandalorian episode. But yeah, I think that, again, it's not even, for me anyway, it's not even so much the benefit of the doubt, because I thought she knocked it out of the park with the Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett. It was one of the few times where somebody that you really wanted to see, right? Like, you imagine somebody in a role, and then let's say they get that role. A lot of times what happens is you're kind of like, they look like the character, but there's something missing. But in this case, honestly, I don't know, man. I think that she's perfect. Like, she is the embodiment. Because I will be honest, there was a big part of me that said, okay, if not Rosario, I think what they could have done was gotten Ashley Eckstein into shape. That sounds so terrible. And I so don't mean it like that. But, you know, they could have bulked her up and got her a little bit more, shall we just say, Ahsoka-like. And used her, because she was the one that voiced the character in, like, everything, right? The Clone Wars, Rebels, you know, there was even talk, they didn't do it, obviously, thankfully, but there was even talk that they were going to dub Rosario's voice with Ashley to give it that continuity. But that would have been a terrible decision. I think the best thing to do is pretty much what they did. But if they weren't going to have Rosario in the role, the only other thing that I would have liked to have seen is maybe give Ashley a chance to play this role in live action. Much the same way they did with, oh man, I just blanked on her name. Oh, I can't believe I just blanked on her name. The one that plays Bo-Katan. Oh, and I mean, she was on, Battlestar Galactica, started like in 24, and oh man, I can't believe Katie Sackhoff. Hey, look at that. I got it. You guys didn't have to help me on that one. So with Katie Sackhoff, she basically played Bo-Katan. She voiced Bo-Katan. And then she got the opportunity to play her in live action. So they could have done something like that. And I think there's rumors that, is it Lars Mikkelsen or whatever? I think that's who voiced Thrawn in Rebels. May actually play him in live action. So, there's hope, I think, with some of this stuff. But in the case of Ahsoka, I get it. And Rosario, I always thought looked the part. So I'm fully on board. But again, I think the important thing is that in addition to, again, her continuing to do an amazing, fabulous job in this role from a writing perspective, because again, characters, people have played amazing characters before, but then the writing's horrible. That's actually one of the problems with the prequels, is the fact that, you had all these great actors in their roles, but he just gave them kind of terrible wooden dialogue, and you didn't direct them at all. I mean, it's basically, okay, act in this giant warehouse lined with green, and pretend there's a bunch of people there, and they probably didn't even get that much direction, because George Lucas is notorious for not really understanding and being very good at interacting with actors. See what I did there? But again, I think the key is for Ahsoka is writing. And I think that the writing will be pretty good. It's just because really there's three components when you really break down any kind of a project like this, whether it be a movie or whether it be any kind of a TV series. And again, I mean, there is the production value too, but I'm not really going to count that so much. A lot of it is the acting on point? Is the writing on point? Is the execution on point? You can have a well-written, well-acted film that has poor execution. Maybe the pacing's off. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, right? So if those three ingredients are there, and yes, obviously you have to have production value, especially in Star Wars. Those three ingredients are there, I think you're good. Voyager says Hayden was in LA doing Obi-Wan Kenobi press during the time they were filming Ahsoka. I wonder if that's when he was filming his scenes for Ahsoka. I'm hoping he's in more than one episode. Yeah, to be honest, for me, I'll give the same answer they gave with Obi-Wan, because there was a lot of speculation on, how many scenes are we going to get where Anakin is just Anakin? Or, okay, Qui-Gon's going to probably be in it, but for how long? My only two criteria are, don't shoehorn the character in just for the sake of having the character in the thing. Just have it make sense. Have it make sense and have it be well written. That's all I ask. So as far as Anakin goes, I don't doubt that at some point, and I would even venture to say it was before the press tour, Because I don't know, I guess it could, because like you said, they were still filming during that time, but I don't know. It just seems whenever you're on a press tour, you really, man, I'm sorry guys, I'm going to make all these bad puns, but you're really pressed for time. You know, there's not a whole lot of time to do anything else. I suspect that it would probably be around the time they were shooting Obi-Wan, or maybe when Obi-Wan wrapped, before all the press started. But, you know, it could have been. Again, and you bring the point up, it depends on how extensive the role is, right? I mean, if it's something you can knock out in a day, like, okay, I'm supposed to be here on Monday, and then I fly out to this place on Wednesday, I got Tuesday open. Yeah, all right, we just need you for a day. You can knock the scenes out in a day, you're good. On the other hand, if the guy's playing a huge role in this thing, well then, maybe not so much. Maybe he needed some time. As far as how much of the show I hope he's in, that's a really difficult thing for me anyway to answer, because I would have to know what the context is. That's kind of the word of the day, is context. Because it plays a lot in the discussion that we've had. And that is that if he requires a lot of time because of the story they're trying to tell, well then by all means, put him in every episode. But again, what I want them to avoid is just don't put him in an episode. Just don't put him in episodes where he doesn't belong. You're shoehorning it in. It's like, okay, people are loving Obi-Wan. People are loving Anakin. Hayden Christensen wants to play Anakin, so let's let him play Anakin until, you know, he's sick of it or we're sick of it, right? Problem is, does he belong in the episode or not? That's the first question that I'm hoping these writers are asking. You know, forget what the fans want, forget what even the actors want, even forget what the production team wants as fans. Question is, from a story perspective, does a character belong in there or not? If he does, put him in. If he doesn't, don't. Voyager goes on to say, thank you, Voyager, for chatting in. Do you like the phrase the Mandoverse to describe Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, and Ahsoka? Well, I guess it makes more sense with the Book of Boba Fett and the Mandalorian, because they're not only are they both Mandalorians, which of course from earlier in this episode, you guys heard me talking about how some of the canon and all that was changed. That was another one. You know, Boba Fett and Jango Fett were not originally Mandalorians. They're just guys that kind of adopted that persona and got some armor. And they were feared, but they were also hated by real Mandalorians. Well, Mandalorian Season 2 basically changed that. So it does make sense from that standpoint. With Ahsoka, I mean, if you're just sticking with just the series description, maybe it's a little bit of a stretch. But again, depends. I mean, maybe we see a gang of Mandalorians in them. But the bottom line is it's called the Mandoverse because The Mandalorian was the first series. The first series that came out took place 6 years after Return of the Jedi, or 5. I can never remember which one it is. It's 5 or 6. And okay, these other two shows take place around the same time, and it just became known as the Mandoverse because of that. Now, of course, the other reason why it became known as the Mandoverse is because you had Ahsoka and the Mandalorian, you had the Mandalorian in Book of Boba Fett, you had Boba Fett and the Mandalorian. So you basically have a lot of crossover, right? There's all this crossover, and I'm sure one or both of those characters, you're either going to see Din or Boba Fett or both pop up in Ahsoka too. So because of that, it doesn't bother me. In fact, that was one of those things I honestly jumped on board with, and I didn't even really think about it, which is kind of funny. because usually I start analyzing stuff like that. And usually if I don't like something, I tend to voice it. And a lot of times I voice it on the show. And sometimes I have pretty funny tirades that happen on the show. Actually, one of the things that and we addressed this, I think, last Friday, because that's right, we were supposed to go live Monday, but we couldn't. I mean, it was a holiday anyway, which, I don't know, maybe if I had thought of that, I wouldn't have. Or maybe we could have done a pre-record then. So getting back to your question, Voyager, about the whole pre-record versus live. Because that's the other thing, too. Just so you guys know, we do pre-record episodes if we know we're not going to be able to go live. Because that's the other problem with going live and not doing this as a full-time gig, is the fact that sometimes the things that are your full-time gig get in the way. Which means, I would say like 80% of the time, we're pretty much on schedule. Then there's that other 20% where, I wonder why they're not live. So what we try to do is, if we know we can't be live on a particular day, we'll pre-record an episode. We'll kick that episode out at our normal live time, 8 o'clock, whether it's Friday or Monday. And then, if it's at all possible, one or both of us will actually chat in during that episode. So it's kind of weird when you're chatting about things that I'm basically chatting in response to myself, but, we make it work. Which reminds me, it'll be a week from tonight. We will not be live. I'm going to try to see if I can sneak in a pre-recorded episode for next Friday, speaking of which. But Monday, you're not going to want to miss us, because we're actually going to do, and you can set the notification bell. The event is up. You can check it out a little bit. We're going to do the whole discussion about de-aging versus recasting. So you're not going to want to miss that, because that's going to be something, that's something that's really going to be, and it's not just Star Wars, but I mean, it's like pretty much any franchise film, any franchise that's been going on for a while. You've seen a lot of this in the Marvel movies, and it's going to go to a lot of different series. So we're going to basically discuss the differences, the advantages, the disadvantages, and then which one's actually better, which is ultimately the best thing to do. Now, I'm sure we're going to drift into some of the other, things that, some of the other franchises that may use it, or some other stuff like that, some of the other technology, but it's pretty much going to be as it relates to Star Wars. What's the best? Do you de-age Harrison Ford, or do you put Alden Ehrenreich in? Or maybe somebody else if, you didn't really like him. Do you de-age Carrie? Well, it'd be tough to do Carrie Fisher. I guess you could, but you'd have to use AI to do her voice and then have somebody, that could get a little messy. Or do you use Millie Bobby Brown, which is who I would probably at this point like to see recast as Leia if they do Leia during that time period. The other option with Leia, right, is you could just wait till the actress that played her in Obi-Wan. She's probably about 10 years old. I mean, I know she's playing 10 years old. I don't know if the actress is or not, but she's around that. Wait 5 years. And then start doing all the young Leia stuff. And then you have continuity, because at that point, you actually have a person you've already recast playing those roles. See, the problem with the Harrison Ford Han Solo thing was the fact that if you start making stuff that's a little too close to either episode 4 or episode 6, or you want to start dealing with some of the stuff in between, it's going to be tough because if you put Alden Ehrenreich in, which of course would make sense because you've already cast him as Solo in one thing. The problem is that, I mean, Harrison Ford was only like, I don't know, 31 or something like that when he did 30 or 31, something like that when he did episode 4. So, you know, that would be kind of tough. It's a lot easier. See, Ewan McGregor doesn't have a Ewan McGregor doesn't have a problem because Alec Guinness was old enough that when you recast Ewan as like a young, 19, 20-year-old Obi-Wan or whatever, we've been able to grow up with that character, right? So he went up through episode 3, and now he's back for the Obi-Wan show, and he's pretty much age appropriate. And even if they use him to where he gets closer to that Alec Guinness portrayal, we have had Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan for so long that even to me, a guy who pretty much saw Star Wars in 77, I grew up with the Alec Guinness character, but to be honest, Ewan McGregor is Obi-Wan in my eyes. So I'd have no problem with it. Voyager says, Alden was so boring, I'm sorry. No, dude, I'm right there with you. Harrison Ford is so charismatic. See, the problem is it's not that Alden Ehrenreich is a bad actor. He's not. But they just should have chosen somebody different. Now, Taron Egerton was up for the role. He may have been... I don't know if he would have been better. I know he would have been different. But what they really needed to do was get somebody that resembled a young Harrison Ford who kind of had that swagger. That swagger and that charisma, like Voyager said, Because the Harrison Ford portrayal of Han Solo, I mean, he is Han Solo. It's one of those things where and again, one of the remarkable things about Harrison Ford was he created 2 iconic characters, because you could say Harrison Ford is Indiana Jones. And it's really strange, because usually when people get typecast, they would get typecast as a particular character. But with Harrison Ford, you don't really see him as one or the other. I mean, I guess, unless you're not an Indiana Jones fan and you only like Star Wars or vice versa. But yeah, I agree. They really made a bad mistake, and I think even though I started getting into the spirit of it, because I did really enjoy the Solo movie, I thought it was way better than what it was given credit for, but it just never really felt like Han Solo to me. Because people kept trying to say, well, he hadn't really grown into his Han Solo-ness yet. But it's like, dude, it was only like, I don't know, 10 years. I guess if you're, 20, 22 versus 31 or 32, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of growth there. But still, it just didn't feel like the same character to me. I don't know. But again, the question comes to, what do you guys think? So as we wrap up today, again, first I want to thank Voyager for coming in and chatting with me a little bit. That was good. And again, you guys are more than welcome to chat in the comment section. Let me know what you guys think of all this stuff. The question for this episode is, do you think that Ahsoka should rely a little bit more on some of the past stuff like Rebels and everything and bring that more in? And just, hey, look, if you're a casual fan, it's fine. Get what you can out of it, but we really need all that. Or do you agree with the direction that they're going in? Do you think that this should be something that they make more of a standalone, and then maybe they give you little Easter eggs here and there, a little bit of fan service, just little references here and there, but nothing too heavy that a person would be lost. So just let us know in the comments section. Again, you don't want to miss us Monday night, 8 o'clock. We're going to be talking de-aging versus recasting. Which is better? Which is better overall? Especially which is better for Star Wars. If you haven't done so, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, as I said earlier. Hey, if you don't want to be notified every single time we go on, there's like personalized notifications in there that you can do, so have it that. And in the meantime, Daryl should be back with me on Monday, where we're going to be discussing, hopefully with you guys, de-aging versus recasting. So until then, may the Force be with you always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you always.